Since our first presidential election in 1788, we've elected some great presidents. We've also made some bad decisions and elected presidents who, either by personal failure or because these men were simply not up to the awesome responsibilities of the presidency, turned out to be not so great. Today, I would like to compare some consistently low-ranking presidents, as well as a number of more controversial presidents, and try to figure out exactly who was the worst. This pool of 11 includes Warren Harding, Woodrow Wilson, Grover Cleveland, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, James Buchanan, Franklin Pierce, John Adams, and Andrew Johnson. The way we'll be ranking these presidents is by scoring them off at the list of bad things which presidents can do, such as being impeached or having impeachment seriously and reasonably considered by Congress, being generally unpopular in their presidency, being generally unpopular from a modern perspective, having personal failures such as prejudice, racism, unfaithfulness, and other despicable behaviors, professional failures such as not delivering on campaign promises or being undiplomatic or breaking the law, failing to support the Constitution or defend the Union, being divisive, having a lack of political capital, intentional failure to protect the civil liberties of large groups, having never won the presidency in their own right, starting or participating in an unpopular war, and lack of experience. Each of these 11 presidents will be scored on a scale of 1 to 10, depending on whether they did or did not do these things, how much they did them, and then they will be given a final score, and the president who has the overall worst score will be considered, at least by this channel's standards, the worst president. These presidents will also be given a letter grade based on how high their positive score is. Of course, if one of these presidents gets an A or even an A+, it doesn't mean that they are a great president, it just means that, out of the worst presidents, they are relatively good. Also, to a reasonable extent, the president's actions will be given the context of their times. So, in no particular order, let's rank each of these worst presidents. John Adams was the first really unpopular president, with a general disapproval rating of about 54% while in office, so we'll give him a 5.4 in unpopularity. Nowadays, historians give him a little bit more slack with a disapproval rating of about 46%. So far as personal failures go, Adams had few other than a short temper. He was actually a Quaker, which was a progressive religious group which supported abolition as early as the 1680s. Adams never really failed constitutionally either. Being a Federalist, Adams supported the empowerment of the presidency and the federal government in general, which made many of the more conservative Democratic Republicans believe that Adams was an imperialist, wanting the presidency to be a more powerful and even tyrannical position. These accusations, which were normally just rhetoric and not really supported by facts in any form, were completely bogus. But they still had a great effect, making him generally unpopular among average Americans, and even making him unpopular among many members of his own party. This really crippled him politically, so we give him a 7 on lack of political capital, and a 0 on failing to uphold the Constitution. This political handicap meant he couldn't get much of his agenda through Congress, making a score on his failure to deliver on campaign promises a 4. Adams, being our second president, wasn't very divisive either, and tried his best to strengthen the central government and create a system in which the states of the Union would be indivisible. So on that score of divisiveness, Adams gets a 2.5 out of 10. Adams, as previously mentioned, wasn't a particularly oppressive president, and certainly not towards any particular minority groups, so he gets a 0 on failure to protect civil liberties. Adams also won the presidency himself and gets a 0 on never having been elected in his own right score. Adams was president during the quasi-war with France, which was basically the Cold War before the Cold War, but much shorter and with France, and also without the threat of nuclear destruction. Since war was never really officially declared and no soldiers were officially committed, I'll give Adams a 0 on starting or participating in unpopular wars. Adams also had plenty of experience, from ambassadorship to serving on the Continental Congress and then being elected George Washington's vice president, so he gets a 0 on lack of experience. This brings Adams' total score to a 22 out of a possible 120. And remember, the lower the score, the better, which gives Adams an 82% positive score, which is a B-. John Tyler was the first of our accidental presidents, or vice presidents who became president after the death of the president they served with. Tyler was never elected in his own right, was very unpopular among his own party, and was even referred to as a wino, or Whig in name only. Given that there weren't actual presidential approval ratings back in the day, I'd guess by just looking at election results that his disapproval ratings were probably in the 60s or even the 70s. Today, historians give him a similar disapproval rating of 65. Tyler was also the first president to be seriously looked at for impeachment over his use of the veto. Many argued that since he was never elected to the presidency, he didn't have the right to use veto powers. Tyler was narrowly spared impeachment. Even a few more votes in that direction would have resulted in his impeachment and maybe even removal from office. Tyler was also the only president to support the Confederacy when the Civil War came around. He was also generally despicable otherwise, so his personal failure score has to be around 8. Tyler never really broke the law in office. Since the time of his attempted impeachment, many accidental presidents have used the veto power, and I think it's generally accepted that it is the right of all presidents, no matter how they got that office. Also, though he had absolutely no political capital, seeing as he never really campaigned for office in the first place, he had few promises to fulfill, so his professional failure score has to be fairly low, let's say a 3. Though he would later betray the Union, that would be in his post-presidency, and at least during his presidency, he never did much to outright violate the Constitution. He also wasn't a very divisive president, in that those who did support him only supported him in a lukewarm sort of way, and most people were sort of united in their disapproval of Tyler. Tyler was also a slaveholder, so his intentional failure to support the civil liberties of others score has to be high. This leaves Tyler with a total score of 57.5 out of 120, or 52% positive, which is an easy F. Next up is the very controversial Andrew Jackson. Jackson was pretty popular during his time, and for many decades after. He was a new type of president, a citizen president who could relate with the common man and understand them better than most politicians could. But he was also a military man, a war hero, and a politician who had the unique advantage of also being a common man's hero. That's certainly a good quality, and it won him a great deal of popularity, having a disapproval rating of about 4.4. But by today's standards, Jackson was an incredibly flawed man. He was very racist, and he had a great amount of personal prejudice, owning slaves in addition to his roles in the so-called Indian Wars, as well as the Trail of Tears. But his average rating by historians is still pretty high, with an average disapproval of about 55%, so I'll give him a 5.5 on modern disapproval. I'll also give him a 7 on personal failures, because he was, after all, a man of his times. But that he was so violently prejudiced, and that he acted on that prejudice and made policies also from that prejudice, is particularly despicable, even given the context of the times. His role in the practical genocide of the Eastern Native Americans also gives him a 10 on failures to protect the civil liberties of specific groups. But these terrible policies, as well as a number of other policies which were less terrible, were very popular at the time. This gave him a great deal of political capital and allowed him to do most anything he would like to do politically, so his lack of political capital score is a 1, and his professional failure score is a 2. During the time of his presidency, he only had one major professional controversy, at least so far as most people were concerned. That was his exercising of strength over South Carolina, which was threatening to secede the Union. By Jackson's quick and decisive movements, he postponed the Civil War by about 40 years. But many Southerners thought this action was unconstitutional and even tyrannical, which made him somewhat unpopular and even divisive in the Deep South. So his divisiveness score is a 4. This brings Jackson's total score up to a 36 of 120, or a 70% positive score, which is a C-. Van Buren was vice president under Jackson and president right after Jackson left office. So when he entered office, he already had a fair amount of experience. In this time, he was also considered a pretty mid-president, with about a 52% disapproval rating. Historians now give him a 55 disapproval, which isn't much change. Van Buren was very similar to Jackson in his policies towards the Native Americans, and the worst of the Trail of Tears happened under his presidency, so his personal failure score would have to be a 5, slightly lower than Jackson because Van Buren never was a big slaveholder, and even joined a party which supported abolition later in life. But Van Buren never really came around to abolition himself. He, being supported by the still very popular Andrew Jackson all throughout his presidency, had a good deal of political capital, which allowed him to put the Democratic Party's platform through Congress pretty much as he had liked to, until near the end of his term when it became fairly certain that he'd lose re-election to William Henry Harrison and the Whigs. But he was also much more divisive than Andrew Jackson. While Jackson seemed like an average man's president, Van Buren seemed much more politician-like. He came from a Dutch family, and English wasn't even his first language, which alienated even more from the average person. I'd say he was a 6 on divisiveness, just 2 points higher than I gave Jackson. This gives Van Buren a 37.7 out of 120, or a 68% positive score, which is a D+. Fillmore was our second accidental president, becoming president after Zachary Taylor died of a stomach virus, a little less than halfway into his term. Historians mostly agree with the approval of him while he was in office, and that they both have a negative opinion, with a high 55% disapproval rating. What Fillmore is best remembered for was his failure to stand up to slavery, and particularly the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave catchers to come up from slave states and into free states to catch escaped slaves. Fillmore was personally morally opposed to slavery, like a lot of the early presidents, but didn't believe he constitutionally had the right to abolish slavery outright. This, of course, didn't give him much of a moral redemption, so I'll give him a personal failure score of 5. For professional failures, Fillmore had few. He had very few campaign promises to deliver on, and no matter, his party, the Democrats, had a pretty firm hold on both houses of Congress all throughout his term. He also had some political capital, slightly less than he would have if he were elected in his own right. And Fillmore was pretty divisive, so he gets a 4 on that score. This brings Fillmore's overall score to a 32.5 out of 120, or 72% positive, which is a C-. Franklin Pierce is probably one of the most unpopular presidents as ranked by historians, with disapproval ratings in the mid-70s. In his presidency, he was also ranked lowly with a disapproval rating in the mid-60s. Pierce was incredibly prejudiced, and so gets a 7 on personal failures. Pierce and the Democrats also had more seats in Congress than any other party, though no one had an outright majority in the House at that time. Most of his agenda got through and was particularly divisive, but some things, like his wanting to annex Cuba, and turn it into a slave state were shot down. So he gets a 5 on divisiveness, a 4 on lack of political capital, and a 5 on professional failures. Pierce himself, like Fillmore, never owned slaves, but Pierce did not support abolition and believed the Constitution supported slavery. So I'll give him the same score as Fillmore on preventing civil liberties with a 6. This brings Pierce's total score to a 44.5, which is 62% positive, or a D. Cleveland is probably one of the most despicable presidents, at least so far as personality goes. There's been a lot of controversy around it, and that controversy lasts to this day. But Cleveland was accused of raping a woman and abandoning the child thereof. This is where the song, Ma, Ma, Where's My Pa, in the White House, Ha, 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 comes from. Whether or not these accusations are true, I don't have the authority to say, but I personally wouldn't put it past him. Cleveland was also married to his own daughter. I mean, technically, the girl was his goddaughter, and he raised her from the age of 11. When she was 21 and he was nearly 50, the two married. To put the age difference into presidential terms, Grover was born during the Van Buren administration, and his wife died during the Truman administration. The whole situation is weird and creepy, and I'd like to move on, but not before giving him a 7 on personal failures. For this creepy stuff, as well as his terrible racism. The reason it's not a full-out 10 is that Cleveland was an honest man and had a great deal of integrity during what is called the Gilded Age, a time of government corruption and lies. In spite of all this just gross behavior, Grover was more popular than he ought to have been, with about a 52% disapproval while in office and a modern disapproval of 50%. Cleveland also had a decent amount of political capital and was able to get much of the Democratic platform through Congress, making his professional failure score a 3, and his lack of capital score a 3-2. Cleveland also had few run-ins with the Constitution and tried his best to support it, so his score on that count is a 4. Cleveland owed his presidency, in the first place, to massive voter suppression of thousands of black voters in the South, and continued to support it, or at best, abide by it, and those despicable laws of Jim Crow in the South, so his intentional failures to protect the civil liberties of large groups score has to be a 6. Cleveland went from being the practically unknown former sheriff of Erie County to the mayor of Buffalo City, to the governor of New York, and then to the presidency in a little over 3 years. So though on paper he had a decent amount of experience, he's probably one of the most inexperienced presidents we've ever had. So his inexperience score is probably around a 7 or a 6. Let's call it a 6.5. His total score is a 46.7 out of 120. 61% positive, which is a C-. Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, nearly 50 years after the end of the Civil War. But he was the first president to come from the southern state since Andrew Johnson, and as such, southern prejudice and flaws were sort of ingrained in him. A brave man would have been able to overcome these prejudices, but Wilson was not a brave man. Wilson was incredibly racist. In fact, he was the one who brought the Southern Jim Crow laws to the whole of the nation, and he and his policies segregated the federal government. He was the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland in the mid-1890s, and only won because Teddy Roosevelt split the Republican ticket by running with the Bull Moose Party and challenging Taft. Wilson managed to win with just 40% of the popular vote, and by some miracle and false promises, he managed to win re-election in 1916. So his generally unpopular score during his term is a 5.5 out of 10, while his modern disapproval is something around a 6. Also, in 1916, Wilson's campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." The idea of intervening in World War I was very unpopular among practically all Americans. Isolationism was still very popular, yet almost immediately after his second inauguration, the U.S. entered the war. This was a betrayal not just of a campaign promise, but a betrayal of the campaign promise, entering an all-around unpopular war. So Wilson gets an 8 on professional failures and an 8 on participating in unpopular wars. As previously mentioned, Wilson was the president who segregated the federal government and also failed to stand up to the KKK, and so gets a 10 on failure to protect civil rights. Wilson was president of Princeton University for 8 years. He was then elected governor of New Jersey in 1911, serving for just 2 years before he became president. So he was very inexperienced, with a 4 on that score. So Wilson gets a total of 71.5 out of a possible 120. 40% positive, which is an easy F. James Buchanan, former minister to England, Russia, he was the Secretary of State and a congressman, is commonly seen as our single worst president. I disagree, but that's not to say he's not far down there. Many historians give him about a 75% disapproval rating, and he had a similar 70% while in office. Buchanan was generally less prejudiced than most of the presidents listed before, so his personal failures rating has to be a 4.5. Professionally, Buchanan's presidency was a complete failure. Not only did he have very little pull with Congress, he is also the president most responsible for the Civil War. So, for professional failures, I'll give him an 8. Lack of political capital, a 7. And failure to support the Constitution or the Union, a 10. He was unpopular not just by Republicans, but also by his own Democrats. Many times during the Civil War, Buchanan was burnt or hung or otherwise killed in effigy for his failure to prevent the secession of southern states. So I'll give him a 6 on divisiveness, bringing his total score to a 73, which is 39% positive, which is the lowest score yet. Warren Harding's administration had scandal and corruption all throughout, from before he was even nominated by the Republican Party in 1920 to his death while in office in 1923. The Teapot Dome scandal, probably the greatest presidential scandal other than Watergate itself, in which members of Harding's administration basically accepted bribes from large oil companies and allowed them to mine at certain locations for low cost and without any real competition, was probably the biggest scandal of his administration. Harding himself probably had nothing to do with this particular scandal, but that's not because he was uncorrupt. He cheated on his wife, he had a number of mistresses, at least one of which had his child. In spite of his administrations and his personal corruption, he was more popular than you'd expect, with a disapproval rating around 65%, and most historians agree. Harding will also get an 8 for personal failures, given his unfaithfulness to his wife as well as just his dishonesty otherwise. When he was first elected in 1920, he carried the election with 60% of the popular vote. But his administration went on, and the scandal stacked, his popularity began to wane, and so his political capital began to evaporate too. But that didn't mean his agenda was dead. The Republican Party was in control of both houses even after the 1922 midterms, and so, really, most of the Republican platform managed to survive. This gives Harding a lack of capital score of 6.5, but a professional failure score of a 4. In spite of all these scandals, Harding had few run-ins with the Constitution and gets a 3 on unconstitutionality. Harding was also supportive of women's suffrage as well as general equal rights, but he did little to desegregate the government or anything of that sort, so he gets a 4 on failure to protect civil liberties, which gives him a total score of 43.5 out of 120, which is 63% positive, which is a D. Johnson, the Southerner and former Democrat, who was the governor of Tennessee for 4 years before the Civil War, and then military governor for most of the war up to his election as vice president. Johnson became president after the assassination of Abe Lincoln, a matter of days after Robert E. Lee unconditionally surrendered to Grant, putting an end to the Confederacy. Johnson was easily one of the most unpopular presidents ever, with a disapproval rating in the 80s both during his time and ours. Johnson was easily the most racist president we have ever had. He was also mean and had a bad temper. He was a complete personal failure. Professionally, he was also a failure, breaking the law several times during office. This also led to impeachment, though he was never fully removed from office. Several times, we almost went back into civil war because of Johnson, so failure to support the Union is a 7. Also, Johnson just allowed the South to adopt systems of segregation to return Southern blacks to a status of near slavery, making a score on intentional failures to protect civil rights a full 10. I would also give him a 5 on divisiveness instead of a full 10, given that since most of the country, both North and South, hated him, they were united, not divided, in their hatred. This brings Johnson's total score to an 86, which is 26% positive, which is an absolutely abysmal score. This makes Andrew Johnson the worst president, followed closely by James Buchanan, the two immediate pre- and post-Civil War presidents. Again, this is just by my personal standards, and isn't necessarily the very same as all historians or even you yourself would say. And there's nothing wrong with that. I didn't include handling of the economy as a factor because of my own lack of understanding of the economy, and I also just believe presidents generally have minimal control over the economy, and to blame them for conditions which they personally had practically no role in or control over would be unfair. Some honorable mentions, or dishonorable mentions depending on how you look at it, are LBJ, William Henry Harrison, Richard Nixon, and Herbert Hoover, but these presidents were disqualified for one reason or another. Also, for the sake of keeping this video as short as possible, I wanted to keep the list relatively short. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'd like to thank you for watching so far through. It means a great deal to me. Goodbye.